This is one of the world's most amazing beauty spots. 600 years ago, Byzantine monks were enthralled by the savage beauty of this strange landscape. The METEORES, scenery of extravagant beauty, suspended between heaven and earth.
It's a unique natural phenomenon. 24 sheer rock peaks jutting up in an area of just 30 square kilometers in the Thessaly Plain, at the heart of central Greece. At the foot of this imposing gray rock formation, with its alternating peaks and cliffs, lies the small town of Kalambaka, gateway to the exploration of the rocks and their mysteries.
Each rock is different, but they all have the smooth contours and rounded shapes characteristic of centuries of erosion by patient winds. There are still doubts as to the origin of these enormous stalagmites, which arise where the Pinos River emerges from the deep canyons of the Pindi mountain range. Some say that they consist in fact of the cores of hard rocks, which, after the erosion of the sandstone and the sandy clay which envelop them, remain isolated.
Others claim that the phenomenon dates back to the Tertiary Age, more than 25 million years ago, at a time when the Thessaly Plain was covered by the waters of a lake. At this spot is said to have been a river delta. The river deposited sand, mud, and pebbles at its mouth. This alluvium first agglomerated to form an enormous cone. Then, the cone fragmented when the water receded, leaving the plain festooned with hills and peaks of all shapes.
These very special rocks have always held a fascination for those who craved the absolute. One somehow felt closer to the gods in their midst. As early as the 9th century, hermits found shelter and a place to worship in these natural caves. They provided safety and serenity. Monastic communities appeared later, in the 14th century.
The formidable challenge that building monasteries on top of these inaccessible rocks must have been continues to amaze us. Throughout the centuries, 24 monasteries were built in all. Only 5 are still inhabited. A slow decline set in after a golden age in the 14th and 15th century.
The universe is eternal. Worlds are born and die. The sea advances and recedes. What is now land may become sea. Everything changes all the time.
When Aristotle had this precocious intuition, the European continent looked much the same as it does today, with the same variety of landscapes, the same diversity of climates.
In fact, on this continent, which isn't very large but is 3 billion years old, everything does change all the time. Sometimes the transformation occurs under our very eyes. Sometimes it is of a scale of history which eludes us. It is the imprint, the life of water, fire, cold.
At the center of the province of Malaga in southern Spain lies a true masterpiece, the scenic wonderland of Torcal d'Antequera, which nature cut out of the Sierra Beticas at an altitude of over 1,400 meters.
The heart of the Torcal is a tangled network of passages, dips, and corridors. It is best not to wander off the marked paths whilst exploring this extravagant labyrinth, for the slightest detour would inevitably lead one astray.
The whims of erosion have sculpted the limestone with fantasy, even talent. In this incongruous assortment of more or less figurative shapes, stacked pancakes are among the most spectacular.
Taken one by one, these broken down rocks are not exceptional. They are characteristic of a caustic or calcareous type erosion. The phenomenon can be found in several other spots in Europe. What makes Torcal so exceptional is the number, scope, and beauty of the eroded rocks. This monumental ensemble is practically unique in the world.
The present vegetation of the massif is composed of nice variety of shrubs and bushes that grow between or on the rocks. In the midst of the scorching summer heat, it's hard to imagine that we owe this incredible architecture to the flowing of water over limestone.
Limestone is especially vulnerable to erosion by water because it then is subjected to a dual action: mechanical erosion, the contact of the water wears the rock down, and chemical erosion, whereby slightly acid or carbonated rain or streaming water dissolves the limestone. This vulnerability to water can be particularly spectacular when a river crosses a limestone plateau.
Here, in the south of France, the Ardèche River literally cuts through the Belize Plateau, the water dissolving and washing away limestone that is 110 million years old. The bed of the river has gradually dropped, leaving a height of up to 300 meters between the water and the upper rim of the plateau. The present position of the riverbed only dates back 4,500 years, but the formation of the canyon is said to have begun 3 million years ago. Some even say that the beginning of the burrowing of the Ardèche coincides with the alpine rising phase 20 million years ago.
Upstream, the entrance to the canyon is marked by an extraordinary natural wonder. The Pont d'Arc Arch Bridge is monumental. It's 34 meters high by 59 meters wide. The best way to appreciate its size is to cross under it by boat. In summer, more than 1,000 canoes or kayaks pass under this arch daily.
According to legend, the Pont d'Arc was suddenly cut out of the rock by heaven in order to allow an aged husband to rescue his young bride who had been carried off by a pilgrim.
There was a chase on the river. The fugitive and the husband were both rowing at the same speed, and the husband was always trailing behind by one bend in the river. Desperate to catch up, he implored heaven to help him, and this passage opened up in the rock. The God-sent shortcut allowed the old man to rescue his wife.
The Ardèche River does, in fact, take a shortcut and skip a bend. A long time ago, it passed around the rocky promontory where it dug out the arch. The flowing of the river slowly chiseled at the cliff and finished by carving out a small passage. The opening was progressively and considerably enlarged by frequent floods. It is generally believed that the Ardèche finally cut through at the end of the Ice Age, when its flow was significantly increased by the multitude of rivulets which poured from the melting glaciers.
The Krimler-Ach River is fed by the floodwaters of 12 glaciers, which isn't surprising in this area of the Austrian Alps, considering that in the province of Salzburg alone, there are 120 peaks over 3,000 meters high. By the time the river reaches the forest at the edge of the Salzach Valley, its volume is considerable. A series of 3 waterfalls for a total drop of 380 meters.
The Krimler Falls are considered to be the most beautiful waterfalls of the Alpine range. This is water, but most of all to the beauty of the surroundings. They are located in the Hope-Victorian Natural Park and have the advantage of being in a protected natural environment. The trail, well maintained by the local mountain club, offers 1,000 lookout points, which allow hikers to observe the fall's splendor from all sides.
Of all the countries in Europe, Norway is probably the one to offer the greatest variety of waterfalls. In the province of Nordfjord, it is possible to observe both the thundering power of a waterfall and its frozen origin. It's one of Norway's most popular tourist attractions. At the very end of the Oldedalen Valley, horse-drawn carriages allow access to the BRIKSDAL glacier.
The BRIKSDAL is but a strip of the huge VATNAJÖKULL glacier. Covering 475 square kilometers, the VATNAJÖKULL is the largest glacier in continental Europe. It's a remnant of the colossal mass of ice which covered the globe millions of years ago.
Upon approaching the glacier, one is surprised by the sound of this enormous tongue of ice. The sinister creaking reminds one that the glacier, which seems immobile, is in fact advancing ceaselessly. One can imagine the erosive power of this massive bulk of ice, which has released a small glacial lake at its base. Relentlessly, the thaw continues. Occasionally, large blocks of ice, which could pass for small icebergs, break off from the edges of the glacier. The spectacle offered by the continental glaciers remains without measure compared to the immensity of this Icelandic giant. 8,400 square kilometers, larger than some countries. At certain spots, the thickness of the ice reaches 1,000 meters. The third largest glacier in the world, it is like a piece of the North Pole, just 3 hours by plane from London or Paris. 4,000 square meters of polar ice cap is added every year several meters of snow, which for the most part becomes ice in its turn.
This new ice age is not sufficient, however, to make up for the glacier's thaw. There was in our recent history what has been called a little ice age, a period of cooling where the glaciers actually progressed, but the phenomenon ceased in the middle of the last century. On the contrary, since 1920, the climate has been warming rapidly. The VATNAJÖKULL once touched the sea at this spot. When it receded, it left a lake, the Jökulsárlón. During the winter, it takes a keen eye to distinguish where the frozen water of the lake begins and where the glacier ends.
These little chunks of ice on the black sands of the beach signal the approach of summer. Lake Jökulsárlón is thawing. Through the channel which connects it to the ocean, icebergs slowly drift out to sea. In Iceland, even today one can witness a frozen spectacular, but during the Quaternary period, it was the whole of the European continent that was ground under glaciers. In Finland, the Scandinavian ice shield eroded vast areas and created a multitude of shallow, crystal-clear lakes. The region of Samaja in southeast Finland, just a few kilometers from the Russian border, is famous for its myriad lakes.
In 1803, Alexander I, Tsar of Russia, is struck by the beauty of this spot and decides it must be preserved. 40 years later, Nicholas I has this lodge built. This romantic landscape is called Punkarayu, which, strangely enough, means the back of a pig in Finnish. It's a most original natural curiosity, and also one of the most discreet.
For it's difficult to be astonished by this causeway running amidst the lakes. And yet, over 7 kilometers, the road follows the contour of the terrain, climbs, descends, winding through the pine trees. One begins to understand how this camel-backed strip of earth got its name. It is so narrow, with such a clear outline, that it seems to be a man-made embankment designed for lake traffic. In fact, it's a completely natural moraine ridge, a vestige of the Ice Age.
Menon suuntaan oikealla näkyvä niemi on Toonaan saarta, jossa sijaitsevat Punkaharjun lomakeskus, Kovataiden näyttely retretti sekä koko perheen
The ships
kesämaa.
that cruise Lake Puruvesi allow one to come up close and get a better view of the ridge. The Punkarajo Ridge can gently rise from the level of the lake to a height of 30 meters. For the greatest part of its length, it is perfectly straight. This gravel and sand causeway originated when the polar ice cap still covered the Finnish plateau.
Torrents ran under the glacier, dragging along tons upon tons of pebbles. When the ice melted, the dips dug out by the glacier filled up with water and became lakes. Deposits cast aside by the torrents and rivers left these unusual ribbons.
Punkaraju is the most famous of these natural causeways, but there are many others in Finland.
Lake Balaton in Hungary. Covering almost 600 square kilometers, it is one of the largest lakes in Europe, and in summer, one of the most popular. On the northern shore of the lake, dominated by a beautiful Baroque church, lies the peninsula of Tihany. This peninsula, formed by a volcanic rise, conceals a true natural curiosity, which, although preserved as part of a natural park, is completely forsaken.
One must admit that at first glance this clump of rocks overgrown by vegetation doesn't really seem remarkable. One has to come up close to notice its volcanic origin. Granted, upon closer examination, there are certain traces, certain shapes, cavities, ridges that are a bit intriguing, but nothing to draw a crowd.
Yet this plain-looking chunk of rock is nothing less than an actual petrified geyser. Once we know its origin, we can imagine how water once rose through this duct up to the surface. A phenomenon which can still be observed today in Iceland, in the area of GEYSIR, 100 kilometers from Reykjavik.
vapors and hot water arise from the depths through a multitude of cracks in the earth. Here, in an area of a few square kilometers, primal volcanic forces put on an astounding show. Everywhere the ground fumes, cauldrons bubble, mud breaks.
99% of the rocks in Iceland are volcanic. The porosity of lava allows the abundant rains to filter down to the hot areas underground. Hot springs occur when groundwater is brought to boil by vapors from magma.
At the bottom of the pools, the transparent waters reveal deposits of decomposed silica, sometimes called geyserite. In deference to the lord and master of the spot, they just might spring up at any moment from a nearby well.
Depending upon the season, the atmospheric conditions, or simply its mood, the Struckcore geyser springs to heights up to 22 meters, 3 to 10 times per hour. The Struckcore is the star performer nowadays, having taken over from Grand Geyser, whose spout can shoot up 70 meters high, but who is now mostly inactive and only awakens sporadically. The geyser phenomenon is quite simple. Water is subjected to heat and pressure in underground conduits, causing palpitations. The heated water, being lighter, rises towards the surface. An enormous bubble appears at the orifice. It then only takes more heat to cause a powerful column of steam to pierce the bubble, instantly and explosively vaporizing. Under the gazes of the robust little Icelandic horses, nature here constantly renews the landscape.
Not far from Struckcore, one can admire another surprising phenomenon. The Icelanders call it lazy. These twin basins adorned with white geyserite look like a pair of giant glasses. They're of different colors, and the temperature of the water is different, and yet they're connected by a narrow channel. The warmest, also the bluest, owes its coloring to the diffraction of light playing upon the small particles of silica resting on the bottom of the basin. In Icelandic, geyser simply means to gush.
Except for the bubbling, the spectacle one can observe here in Romania has nothing in common with the hot springs of Iceland. This enigmatic landscape lies in the Buzo region of the Carpathian Mountains. Although they are known as the VULCANI norois, these small eruptions are not of volcanic origin. The muddy paste is quite cold. Each pulsation of the sludge is a bubble of escaping methane gas.
This region's wealth lies in its livestock and its oil fields. Gases escaping from the underground oil layers cause this bubbling. With the gas's pressure, the clay mud pours out of the craters, and upon drying forms cut-off cones, which give the landscape its lunar aspect.
The small geysers in the Sos moors are also of gaseous origin. In this case, it is carbon dioxide which rises out of the peat bogs. The area is located on the German and Czechoslovakian border in the extreme west of Bohemia. It's a few kilometers north of Franciszkowie Lasne, a region of many hot springs.
These 220 protected hectares have many visitors, and although the vegetation and wildlife are worth the detour, people mainly come to see the bubbling springs. The temperature of the water here is 20 degrees centigrade, which is way under the temperature of the waters at VULCANO.
Off the beach of Levant, the temperature of the sea exceeds 60 degrees centigrade, and this time the bubbling is clearly of volcanic origin. Here, in fact, we are on a volcano, which is what gives its name to one of the Lipari Islands, an archipelago north of Sicily. According to Homer, it was here that the god Aeol imprisoned the winds in goatskins. When one lands on Volcano, what is striking is not so much the wind as the smell of sulfur. Nature has endowed these few square kilometers with all the forms and manifestations of the fires of the earth, which suddenly seem surprisingly close at hand.
Towering more than 300 meters above these monsters of cooled lava is La Fossa, Volcano's large crater which continuously spews out its vapors. These vapors contain sulfur dioxide and are highly toxic. Beautiful specimens of sulfur spikes can be found on the slopes of the volcano. In the past, sulfur was extracted by prisoners. There were 500 of them serving out their sentences on the island, and they produced up to 12 tons a year.
This exploitation came to a sudden stop one day in 1888, when La Fossa brutally erupted. The volcano spewed projectiles over 500 meters high, some as large as 20 cubic meters. The eruption lasted 2 years and completely destroyed the village at the foot of the volcano. An hour's climb is sufficient these days to reach the rim, opening onto the 500-meter wide crater. One can even easily reach the bottom. One could almost forget that seismic activity is still intense, and that just recently an earthquake epicenter of volcanic origin was detected less than 1,000 meters under the crater.
Less than 100 kilometers south, in Sicily, Mount Etna's plume of smoke reminds us that we are in the heart of the region of Europe with the most volcanic activity. Bordering the Etna range in the north is the ALCANTARA, an ordinary-looking river, just like another mountain stream. Yet, suddenly it reveals another aspect. Green waters flowing smoothly over polished rocks, and instantly one understands why the place is so renowned. Here, the ALCANTARA runs through extraordinary canyons.
The surprising fantasy of these steep, geometrically chiseled rock faces is owed to its volcanic origin. The riverbed once worked its way through lava spewed out by the Monte Mio. As it hardened, the lava formed the canyon walls. This prism-like rock structure is characteristic of cooling basalt, a property which gave rise to other natural wonders, including one of the world's most famous.
The northern coast of the Antrim Plateau in Ulster. A magnificent, although inhospitable coastline. In 1588, a ship belonging to the Invincible Armada, the Girona, smashed up on these reefs. And yet, for centuries, travelers from the world over have flocked here. They come to admire the amazing geological formation which lies between Port Gany and Port Noffer. In the local dialect, Port Gany refers to a sandy bar, and Port Noffer, a giant's bay.
The Giant's Causeway is an extraordinary collection of basalt columns. There are 37,000 of them, cut so perfectly that they inevitably evoke a huge causeway stretching out to sea. Naturally, a phenomenon of this scope has its very own legend. The causeway is said to be the handiwork of the Irish giant McCool, who built it in order to be able to cross the Sound between Ireland and Scotland without getting wet. Seeing as we now distinguish a small, a medium, and a large causeway, the giant seems to have been a bit confused as to what direction to take.
Most of the columns are hexagonal, although quite a few have 5 sides, and some even have 4, 7, or 8 sides. After having made a wish in his wishing chair, one goes through the Giant's Gate to reach other wonders. The organ, a magnificent set of basalt pillars 12 meters high, and the harp, topped by its chimneys. The cliff is a natural geological cross-section and tells us much about the history of the plateau. Molten lava and basalt successively flowed, cooled, and piled up here during the Tertiary, 60 million years ago. At that time, the west coast of Scotland and northeastern Ireland underwent intense volcanic activity, of which the Antrim Plateau is the main vestige.
Since no traces of ashes or explosions were found here, it seems that the region did not suffer violent eruptions. The lava reached the surface through cracks and crevices, pouring out at ground level at a temperature of 1,000 degrees centigrade and solidifying in the form of hard basalt.
This world-famous attraction, first described in 1693 in a London newspaper, is regularly maintained and preserved.
Relentlessly, the sea pounds at the causeway. The sea advances and recedes. What is now land may become sea. Everything changes all the time.